Hello, my dear students. We are going to learn today about the Keynesian theory of inflation. We have already learned the concept called Keynesian concept called inflationary gap. I hope you remember what is inflationary gap. Okay, so in that context we have already learned that inflation according to Keynes is caused by inflationary gap. And what is this inflationary gap? Inflationary gap. Increase in aggregate demand in excess of aggregate supply at a full employment level creates inflationary gap. And that inflationary gap causes inflation in the economy. So, what is the meaning of all this? He says that in aggregate, every increase in aggregate demand is not called inflationary, or it is not called inflationary gap. Every increase in aggregate demand cannot cause inflation. Then what causes inflation? When inflation occurs only when aggregate demand increases, when aggregate supply remains at the full employment level. You might have seen, you might have heard, you have already studied that Keynesian theory of employment, there are three situations are possible. Remember, there is a underemployment equilibrium, full employment equilibrium, and over full employment equilibrium. So he says that whenever aggregate demand increases after the full employment equilibrium, it will cause inflation because no extra output can be produced after the full employment equilibrium. So let us see with some history. So it is said that his theory is little more than the extension and the generalization of Wicksel's view, which we have already seen. So Keynes, however, made an important departure from classical view. What is an important departure? While classical economists considered an increase in money supply as the cause of an increase in aggregate demand and the only cause of inflation, Keynes postulated that inflation can be caused by increase in aggregate demand. So, when the classical economists, both the classical and neoclassical economists, stressed that what causes inflation is the reason for inflation is money supply, right? Now, Keynes, even though his theory is an extension of Wicksel's view, the departure is that there in the classical theory, the increase in aggregate demand is caused by increase in money supply, whereas he says Keynes postulated that inflation can be caused by increase in aggregate demand, not only due to increase in money supply. Okay. Now, aggregate demand might increase due to increase in real factors. So, he says, he stressed that aggregate demand increases not only due to money supply but also due to increase in real factors. What are the real factors? For instance, increase in consumer demand due to increase in MPC. All these concepts are clear to you. So, when consumer demand increases due to increase in MPC, or it is because of the increase in investment demand, aggregate demand may increase. And you have seen the components of aggregate demand: C plus, I plus, G plus, Xn. Remember, AD is equal to C plus, I plus, D plus, Xn. So these two are already given. What is that called as C? Increase in consumption demand, consumer demand due to increase in MPC. And what is I? Increase in investment demand. And what is G? Increase in government expenditure. And what is X? Increase in Xn. It's due to increase in net export. All these factors are called real factors because that will create a more demand for goods and services because they have more income, and this will also can cause inflation. Okay. So such changes may take place when supply of money remains constant. So even though supply of money remains constant, okay, due to increase in aggregate demand, what will happen? Aggregate demand, the prices may increase. That is what he said, and such increase in prices cause inflation. Now, increase in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, increase in, now he is going to explain the theory. Increase in aggregate demand, comma, aggregate supply remaining constant creates a demand supply gap, which is called as inflationary gap. And according to Keynes, inflationary gap is the cause of inflation. So, dear students, remember, inflationary gap is what? Increase in aggregate demand, aggregate supply remaining constant, there is a demand and supply gap is created, and this gap causes inflation. So, some history from where did he take this view? Keynes expressed his view on inflation in his book How to Pay for the War in 1940, wherein he gave the concept of inflationary gap. Again, inflationary gap, what is an inflationary gap? It's a demand and supply gap. Again, it is explained in detail. Inflationary gap is defined as the planned expenditure in excess of output available at full employment. Planned expenditure in excess of output available at full employment. Okay, so output remaining constant. When aggregate demand expenditure increases, aggregate demand increases, and there is a demand and supply gap, and that is known as inflationary gap. Now, this inflationary gap is also called, is so called because it causes inflation without increasing the level of output. Why it is called? Now, the question is, what is inflationary gap? What causes inflation is inflationary gap. And what is inflationary gap? A demand and supply gap, and a planned expenditure in excess of output available at full employment. Okay, and now why it is called inflationary gap? Because this inflationary gap causes inflation without increasing the level of output. Because I said aggregate supply remaining constant, he is saying. So there is no scope for increasing output. So when the output does not increase and aggregate demand increases, this inflationary gap has come, and this inflationary gap causes inflation. Keynes linked inflationary gap and the consequent inflation to full employment output. Okay, so it is very important to note that when aggregate demand increases after the level of full employment only, it becomes inflationary. Otherwise, demand and supply gap will not be there. It implies that expenditure in excess of output at less than full employment level is not inflationary even if prices increase. So this is a situation, for example, underemployment equilibrium. Suppose the economy is at underemployment equilibrium and aggregate demand increases. When aggregate demand increases, what happens? The income also, the output also increases. Such kind of increase, and prices will also increase. But such kind of increase is not called inflation or inflationary, because whenever the prices increase, there is output as simultaneously output is created, so it is not called inflationary. Okay. For such increase in prices generates additional employment and output. The additional output absorbs the excess demand ultimately without causing inflation. So the concept of inflationary gap and its impact of the price level is explained using Keynesian cross. Now we are going to explain this in terms of Keynesian cross. Now we assume that suppose that the economy is in full employment equilibrium at a point E. We are going to see the diagram where aggregate demand C plus I plus T schedule intersects at the aggregate supply schedule. So we see that this is the point E1. Okay. So here we assume that economy is at the level of full employment. Okay. Economy is at the level of full employment. Okay. So we assume that economy is at the level of full employment at E1. So what is the aggregate demand there? Aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G. And at point E, what do you mean by full employment? At point E, the resources are fully employed. Point E means the E1. Okay. And at the full employment level of output, the aggregate demand equals the aggregate income equals the aggregate expenditure, that is AD is equal to AS, that is Y1 is equal to E1 Y1. Okay, E1 Y1. I don't know, so Y1 it is E1 Y1. Aggregate demand is equal to aggregate the income. Aggregate income is equal to Y1 is equal to aggregate expenditure, that is Y1 E1 Y1. Okay. Now, given the full employment status of the economy, let us suppose that now what is this? Let us suppose that government increases its spending by E1 E2. Now this is a full employment situation. Now government increases its expenditure from E1 to E2. So what happens? This is called delta G. This is called, we have already written, it's called delta G, that is the increase in government expenditure. As a result of that, what happens? The aggregate demand curve increases to C plus I plus G plus delta G. C plus I plus G plus delta G. Okay. Now consequently, as I told you then, but since there is no full employment, additional resources, especially capital and labor, would not be forthcoming in response to additional demand. So this is a full employment level of output, and when aggregate demand increases by an amount equal to delta G, aggregate, this is called aggregate output cannot be brought forth because economy is at the level of full employment. Okay. So definitely it causes what is called a gap. Okay. Therefore this creates a inflationary pressure in the economy, and this inflationary pressure has arisen due to delta G. What is delta G? E1 E2. Therefore E1 E2 is called as inflationary gap. And inflationary gap generates only money income. So what is you see here, Y1 Y2 is only money income, not the real output, without creating matching real output, because the economy is in full employment equilibrium. Okay, why money income is increasing? Because economy is already at the level of full employment. So real output and in real income cannot be increased. So only money income is increased. Therefore, higher factor prices would be offered to draw the factor inputs from their existing employment. Okay, so what happens? You have to read after this here. Since full employment situation is there, so additional resources, especially capital and labor, cannot be forthcoming in response to additional demand. Therefore, what you have to pay? The employers have to pay higher factor prices in order to draw the factor inputs from the already existing employment. Okay, so this creates an inflationary pressure in the economy. This has to be read first. So this inflationary gap arises due to increase in government expenditure, that is E1 E2, and that is known as inflationary gap. And inflationary gap generates only money income without increasing and matching real output, because economy is always in the state of already in the state of full employment equilibrium. Okay. Now you see, the rise in money income would create multiplier effect depending upon MPC. Now money income has already increased, not real income, but is output is not increase, but higher income, higher money is paid to the factors of production. So there is already increase in money income. This increase in money income create a multiplier effect. Remember multiplier? But it means multiple times increase in government expenditure depending upon the MPC. So since the economy is in the state of full employment, additional goods and services would not be forthcoming. The multiplier works only on the money income. So multiplier works only on the money income because output cannot be increased. The prices would therefore rise till the entire extra money income and extra demand are absorbed by the rise in the general price level. So, extra money income and extra demand are absorbed in the general price level. So, what happens here is that the price level, okay, price level will be is equal to multiplier times the increase in aggregate demand. Multiplier times increase in aggregate demand. So, that is what in the equation we said. Therefore, total rise in money income is how much? Delta G into multiplier. Delta G into multiplier. Total rise in money income. So, what is delta G? Delta G is E1, E2. So, E1, E2 into multiplier is the total increase in money income. That is equal to Y1, Y2. See, this much of an increase in government expenditure causes a multiplier increase in the income, which is equals higher than delta G, that is Y1, Y2. Okay. Now, the total rise in general price level would equal. Now, how do you calculate that? That's also equal to E3, E4. Y1, Y2 is also equal to E3, E4. This distance must be same because I copy pasted. It becomes flat and it doesn't look like so. But Y1, Y2 must be equal to E3, E4. Okay. The total rise in general price level would equal E3, E4. That is increase in aggregate demand divided by E4 Y2. E4 Y2. What is E4 Y2? The original aggregate demand into 100. So that is also exactly equal to Y1 Y2, that is the increase in money income, divided by OY1. What is OY1? The original money income. So what does it show into 100? So what does it mean? It means that the increase in aggregate demand and increase in the aggregate demand, the price level increases in exact proportion with the increase in general price level. That is measured in terms of increase in money income. Okay, so percentage, this sums the Keynesian approach to inflation. I hope it is clear to you. So, you have to consider the views one by one. The theories, each theory stresses on only one aspect. Now, classical theory stresses on money supply. Neoclassical theory also stresses on demand for money. So, demand for money, it actually demand for money for transaction purposes and also precautionary purpose. If you add also, demand for money and price level is also related. And then when it comes to the Keynesian economics, so Keynes will say what causes inflation is not only money supply. Even though money supply remains constant, when aggregate demand increases in excess of aggregate supply at the full employment level, it is inflationary. That is known as inflationary gap. And so what is inflationary gap? Why it is called inflationary gap? And how does it cause inflation is already explained. Okay. I think I can move on to the monetary theory of inflation also. Okay, I'll take in the next class. So I wind up here.